Before we start, if you're enjoying these conversations, please make sure that you like or subscribe to Cleaning Up. It really helps other people to find us. Cleaning Up is brought to you by the Liebreich Foundation and the Gilardini Foundation. Hello, I'm Michael Liebreich and this is Cleaning Up. My guest today is Angelina Galiteva. She's the chair of the board of the California Independent System Operator. That's the organization that runs the transmission grid in California. She's been on the board since 2011 and in 2020 was elected chair by her fellow board members. Please welcome Angelina Galiteva. So Angelina, welcome to Cleaning Up.
Thank you for having me, Michael. Great to be here.
It's a great pleasure to see you. It's been some time, and obviously we've had this terrible pandemic, so neither of us have been traveling. I'm trying to remember the last time we met. I think I came to visit you in California.
Yes, you came to the ISO. We had a great visit, and you enjoyed touring our control center, I remember.
That's right. I did visit the control center. Is it called the ISO Control Center or the CAISO? I mean, CAISO would be the California Independent System Operator, correct?
Correct, yes. Or the ISO, which is the Independent System Operator. We usually call it the ISO because we are in California and we know that it's the California ISO.
And I'll tell you one of my takeaways when I visited that control center. So we're going to have to sort of help the audience to imagine this. Some will be watching the video, some will be listening on the podcast, in fact, more on the podcast. And there's this kind of mezzanine with a glass screen in front, and you look down into the control room, and there's all these huge screens and little clusters of people very calmly contemplating this almost what looks like an almost fully automated system, but it looks really complicated. I mean, it's a lot of computers. And one of my takeaways was, I bet it's not always that calm. And another one was, I bet they don't have this amount of technology in lots of the developing world where they're trying to, also integrate lots of variable renewables and do all these complicated things, but not everybody has the incredible resources of a CAISO, right?
That's true. And you do need to have real-time operations, and the more renewables that you have on the grid, you notice probably on the far right, there were 2 desks just dedicated to weather forecasting. And they're so proud of themselves because they basically do not make any errors. They can predict when a cloud cover is coming and how much production for solar systems will go up or down, depending on cloud cover where it is, or when wind picks up or the wind goes down. So it's really exciting. I think their goal is to have a less than 1% error rate.
That's
they
fabulous.
Claim that they're much more precise than the Weather Channel.
So now we're going to come back to some of the times when they may not be looking quite as calm as the day that I visited. But before we do that, let's just take a step back and say, what is it that the CAISO actually does? This is the system operator, but what is it that it does? What is it? How is it? What is its job? And what are its metrics?
The California ISO was set up to operate the California grid. So it covers the California grid, and it also operates the real-time market and the wholesale market for energy sales throughout California. But in the last years, because we're so good and we're so able to integrate renewables and we're such leaders, we decided to also launch a voluntary market, which is the energy imbalance market, and open it for partners throughout the West to join in and optimize the operation of their system. So California now operates 82% of the Western wholesale market in real time, which is really very exciting. And we're looking forward to launching into the day-ahead market too, so that we can optimize even more. Short of a complete RTO or a regional transmission operator, this is the next best thing. So we want to be able to capture the benefits of the market and integrate more renewables. And the result has been decarbonization throughout the West, which is very exciting.
Okay, so there's a lot there. Let's unpack a few of those points that you've made, because first of all, you talked about, so you've got the California, the California grid, but then you've been, right, but then you also talked about the Western region. So there are, how many grids are there in the Western region?
Well, there's separate balancing authorities. So in the Western region, there's 38 balancing authorities. It's like a balkanized system, and each and every one of them is balanced separately with demand and supply. So having an energy imbalance market allows you to be able to integrate those systems in a larger footprint so that you can balance across a larger geographic area and thus optimize operations where you don't need as much reserves. So it becomes easier for everybody to operate.
So in each of those
And the
38,
benefits, correct.
so each of those 38 has got some renewables going up and down. So it's got some variability on the supply side. And in fact, power stations may be, switching on and switching on, either planned maintenance, unplanned, right, variable renewables. And then you've got demand, which is all over the place because you've got all sorts of stuff going on, and Super Bowl halftime, everybody opening the fridge and putting the kettle on and so on. And 38 different groups are doing what the California ISO does. And then you're you've kind of clicked up a layer, and you're also helping to manage imbalances between those. Is that right?
Correct. And to have better integration with their partners. And that helps balance the system, but it also helps with reliability because, as you may remember, Texas had a big problem because they're completely isolated in an isolated grid that doesn't have any interaction with their neighbors. So they weren't able to call on anybody when they had the trouble that they had this last winter. And one of the lessons learned from Texas is you need better integration with your neighbors. The small pieces of Texas that were integrated with the neighboring grids actually fared quite well. But the rest of them couldn't really call on anybody in order to balance the system within their territory. And they did that because they didn't want to have federal regulation. Texas wants to be its own state.
Okay, well, California does a bit of that as well. We'll talk about the geothermal standards maybe if we have time. but wouldn't it be easier if you just got rid of those 38 separate operations and had a single sort of technical operator and a single market and one organization just doing it all, and are you bound to say, well, of course?
Well, yes, of course it would be easier, and that's what the long-term vision was, that you would have separate different RTOs throughout the United States, and that they would be able to operate sort of almost a national grid. I mean, if we had a backbone national grid, we could plan 100% renewable portfolio standard for all of the United States. We don't have a national grid in the United States, but if we were able to have a West-wide integrated grid, of course, that would make operations much easier because you would be able to do transmission planning for the whole region. Right now, each area does its own transmission planning, which is a key component to ensuring that you have even greater integration and you can optimize to the greatest level. So we're not doing it in one step. We tried. It's not going to happen in one step. We're going to do it incrementally, but each step brings benefits. So the energy imbalance market has resulted, we launched it in November of 2014 and have netted about $1.4 billion in benefits for all of the customers who participate. So it's a voluntary market. It's very easy. The threshold is pretty low in terms of cost, and you're able to start achieving benefits right after almost year one of operations. So everybody's been really happy, and the customers actually have been eager to say, okay, we want to go to the next step. We want to go to that day-ahead market. We want full integration. We want greater benefits. And if you don't give it to us, we're going to start looking somewhere else. So now we have a competitor.
Okay, but just let's have a look at you talk about the day-ahead market. Again, our audience, some will know all of this, so I'll apologize to them in advance, but many won't. So right now, what you're doing is helping those 37 other ISOs, system operators. If they get caught short of capacity or if they've got too much, you sort of make a market, but you're doing it in real time. You're doing it on day
real time, 15 minute, 5 minute, yes, hour ahead, yes.
15 minute, 5 minute, hour ahead. So it's a very, it is in financial terms, it's the spot market.
Correct.
But you now want to do a futures market, so somebody can say, well, the wind is going to be low and we're going to need to buy in, so they should be able to provision ahead. Is that right?
Correct, for the day-ahead market. And then you can plan for your day-ahead operations and figure out how much energy you have to allow to participate in the market or not, or how much you need. And then you're able to run a much more efficient market and hopefully have greater benefits.
Okay, and you've reached on the California ISO what percentage of variable renewables, or what percentage of renewables and variable renewables have you reached?
Well, we have a very exciting announcement, because this month we were actually able to reach 95.4% operation with renewables on the grid. It was instantaneous for a few minutes. It wasn't for the whole day, but it was a remarkable record, because this shows that it can be done. We're very close to 100%. I mean, 4% short, 4 or 5% short. But it's very difficult to do it 24 hours, 365 days.
But it's already a big achievement just to do it instantaneously,
Yes.
because a lot of people said, oh, well, there's no inertia. These big spinning machines, which ride through a voltage fluctuations and so on. As soon as you switch them off, you're going to get transients, you're going to get things starting, sparks flying and so on. But that didn't happen.
No, it didn't happen. The system ran, we operated reliably, and we were able to ride through it quite nicely. So yes, you can operate on large percentages of renewables, almost 100%, and that was a huge achievement. We have about 35 to 40% renewables on the grid now, pretty much at all times. But our biggest challenge is the end of the day when we are ramping up. Solar is going down, we're ramping up, and that ramping and flexibility is provided by gas power plants and peaker plants, which are increasingly going to be used less and less and less, but we still need them. So that portion has to be decarbonized, and that's where the focus is. And that's where our weakness on the system is, frankly.
Well, I was going to say, of course, because last year you quite famously had some power outages, right?
Oh, yeah, a couple small ones. Yes, we did.
But again, this is, it's fascinating to talk to you because of your role in California, and California is seen as a postcard from the future quite widely, but nobody quite can work out whether it's a sort of nightmare postcard or whether it's a dream postcard, because the opponents of renewable energy will say, look how foolish, they did all these things and then they had these power cuts, obviously, because variable renewables, or because the sun doesn't shine at night, which they should have been able to forecast. And of course, the fans of renewables will say, oh, no, nothing to see here. We had Jigar Shah on one of the episodes, it was actually episode 9, saying, well, but for all sorts of reasons, that could easily have been much better managed. We could have used more demand response, we could have interconnected more. And so, if you think it's because of the renewables, you're taking the wrong lessons away. So which is it?
It's definitely not because of the renewables. And I would like to say that it's a postcard of the future, which is very positive. Even though we had those small outages, which were due to the ISO, one was about 20 minutes, one was about an hour and a half of a couple of 100,000 customers, that got a lot of press. But if you're looking at operating the system, it's within the parameters of operating a very reliable, whether fossil-based system or any other kind of system. It wasn't the renewables that were the problem. There were some issues with our software in terms of overcounting some capacity that we have. So we've increased our margins from 15% to 17.5. We didn't have enough flexibility in storage, because this did happen after 5 p.m., which is the ramp going upwards. It was a very hot day. It was hot throughout the West. So we couldn't count on imports that were not under contract to really come in, because Las Vegas was 120 degrees, but Portland, Oregon was 105. So everybody needed the power. There wasn't as much excess power throughout the West. So highly unlikely heat wave that covered all of the West and actually strained resources. And also demand response didn't show up as much as we had expected them to show up. They did come in a very large way, but we expected a little bit more. And frankly, what pushed us over the edge was a 400 megawatt power plant not coming online and taking an unscheduled outage. So it wasn't renewables.
That was a gas power plant.
Correct. It wasn't renewables that did it. It was that power plant that just, and wind died. So it was a lot of factors that came in. However, this summer, we have 2,000 megawatts of new battery capacity coming in, lithium ion. So we're going to have another additional 2,000 megawatts we can count on, specifically from the 4 p.m. to 9 p.m. hours, which are going to be the critical ones. And we believe that is going to give us a huge advantage. Plus, we've also adjusted some of our wheel throughs to ensure that we can meet local capacity and demand before we start exporting. Because even during that time, we were also exporting. California is a net importer, but we also export to our neighbors. So there were a lot of factors going on, a lot of lessons learned. I believe we're in much better shape for this summer. But if one thing we know for sure, it was not renewables that did it.
Okay, look, in Texas, you can really say, well, it wasn't renewables because, yeah, some wind tripped out, but it was really minor and the grid was not really counting on it. It was really counting on a lot of gas, and then the gas tripped out, and that was the big problem.
And the coal, everything
and the coal. And so that's my kind of, thumbnail sketch of Texas. But, what you've got going on in California, you've got these targets for renewables, which are, which are very aggressive for 2030 and beyond. And that's compressing the number of hours that the gas plants operate. So they become less and less profitable. And then they get shut down. And you've also shut down the nuclear. So, and then when it breaks, you say, it wasn't us, it was the gas, it was the gas. They should have been more reliable. I mean, is that really fair? In your heart of hearts, is that really fair?
Well, we're repowering the ones through power plants. So we have brand new peaker plants as well. So it's not like they're old clunkers that we're relying on. We're relying on good gas plants to be able to provide that energy. But I get your point. It is true. We're going to have gold-plated gas turbines that are going to operate very few hours throughout the day or even throughout the year. So then the next question is, does it make sense to operate them on gas? And the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, as they're repowering their in-basin power plants, have basically decided that they're going to repower them for hydrogen, and that they're going to be looking for the next fuel to come in and power those turbines, whether it's a blend to begin with and then transition to 100% hydrogen. But the idea is to decarbonize the fuels, because if they're not going to be operating as long, 24/7, we don't need them for baseload necessarily. They're there for flexibility and backup and providing ancillary services. Then why not invest in a fuel that actually is going to contribute to cleaning up the environment and decarbonizing as well?
And will that hydrogen come from California? Because right now, if you drive a Toyota Mirai, my favorite car, brackets not, then it's fueled with, as we discovered during the Texas problem, it was actually fueled with hydrogen from Texas, and actually not clean hydrogen. We're talking about gray or fossil hydrogen, right?
Well, I know. We have to provide green hydrogen, and I think they have an initiative that they've just launched, High LA, that basically focuses on bringing in green hydrogen, using that excess energy, because in the middle of the day, oftentimes we're just curtailing. We have excess energy that we don't even have enough markets around us to push it into. So taking that curtailed energy can be utilized to make hydrogen as well.
Except that the economics on that is horrible. I mean, if you want to have hydrogen electrolyzers and only run them at midday, because you have this famous thing called the duck curve, where the demand drops like the belly of a duck. Then the neck is the difficult bit. That's the bit that made your grid fall over, isn't it? But if you just want to run your electrolyzers, at the belly of the duck time, then they're going to be very, very capital. The capital cost of running an electrolyzer just for a few hours a day is horrible, isn't it?
The objective is to bring it to $1.50. So that's what
$1.50 per kilo of hydrogen.
Yes. And then it becomes cost effective. So the goal is to get there in the next 5 to 7 years. So that's the objective that has been set.
In California.
Yes.
I will celebrate with you willingly if you can get there in 5 to 7 years in California. Because
that's the objective of the initiative launched in LA. And they've had a big launch last week, and everybody is behind it. It's good to have strong goals and high goals, and hopefully you achieve them. So far, we've had a pretty good track record.
Yeah. So the lowest cost that I've heard for kind of current plans that are approaching final investment decision is about $2.50 per kilo, and that's in the Gulf, where they've got very good sun and very good wind. So it's going to be very challenging. I believe it. Look, I'm a big fan of experience curves, and costs will come down. But 5 to 7 years to get to $1.50 in California, that would be going some.
That's what I saw a presentation from NEL, the electrolyzer manufacturers as well. That's their objective. If you're at scale,
Electrolyzer manufacturers promising very low cost hydrogen. What could possibly go wrong?
Nothing.
Why don't you ask them to buy some electrolyzers at the price that will guarantee that that hydrogen cost, given the electricity costs that you're likely to have?
I'm sorry?
Well, if you know what the electricity cost is likely to be, wind and solar in California in 5 or 7 years, perhaps you can calculate what the electrolyzer cost is and make them sign a contract for that price.
Maybe we could, but we're looking at electricity costs, and even though our bills are not that large in California, some people pay larger bills, but typically my bill isn't that big. However, the per kilowatt hour cost is 39 cents a kilowatt hour. So it's pretty high kilowatt hour cost based on infrastructure. So I'm sure that we're all well used to paying a surcharge for certain things to operate the grid. And this is certainly, hydrogen is both a storage fuel and a fuel, and it provides so much flexibility in being able to decarbonize industry as well. So we're looking forward to having that avenue available.
I'm a big fan, I guess. And one of the things, I get involved in these arguments about where hydrogen makes sense, which is very much in industry, and also for long-term storage for these ride through. Yeah. I'm very skeptical about it in transportation, but that's a different topic. I think really, although I'm being mischievous about the electrolyzer cost and what NEL will actually sign up for, but to be honest, if all you're doing is riding through a few hours here and there, frankly, it doesn't matter whether the hydrogen is $1.50 or $2.50 or $3 because you're not using much of it.
That's true. That is true. And actually, the first project that LA is launching is in Utah. It's not even in California. The Intermountain project, which is being repowered, currently running on gas, but it can also run on hydrogen. They're installing wind and solar farms right around it. They'll store it in the salt caverns right close to the power station and start operating on hydrogen as soon as it's feasible. So it's already starting to happen.
Okay, but you're at your 35% plus or minus of renewables now. Your goals are to get to 100%. Is it 100%? No, it's 100% clean energy, not 100% renewables, isn't it?
By 2045.
2045.
Well, because how we define renewables. Large hydro doesn't count as renewable. We limit hydro to 35 megawatts to count as renewable. So if you bring in the hydropower, especially from the Pacific Northwest and for Hoover Dam, and we want it to count towards clean, so therefore it's clean.
Right. And what about nuclear? Because that's more controversial, right?
It's pretty controversial. You saw what happened with the San Onofre power plant. We had a leak right after it was upgraded to the tune of $700 million, and it needed to be shut down because it was infeasible to fix that leak. And so we're now looking at Diablo Canyon, and Diablo Canyon is scheduled to be retired within the next few years. There's some noises being made to keep it online. It's baseload. It's system power. It doesn't provide us the flexibility that we need or the security that we need in terms of operating the grid. So what is a much more exciting prospect, and with the Biden announcement that they're going to support California with offshore wind, is to build offshore wind right off the coast and bring it in through a cable into the infrastructure in San Onofre and into Diablo Canyon, the last nuclear power station, and then use the system infrastructure that already exists to push that power throughout California. And incidentally, offshore wind coincides very nicely with the duck curve because it picks up in the evening, and it will provide us that additional flexibility and the ramp up resources that we need. So we're looking forward to that coming online.
Okay, so you're going for 100% clean energy or clean electricity.
Yes.
I'm trying to think, you also have got 100% clean energy target in California, but that's not your department, right?
Yes. Well, they're also decarbonizing some of the, uses for gas and electrifying it, but that's not our department. That's the California Energy Commission. We work with them, but we'll just provide them the electricity.
And that would be for industry and heating and so on.
Yes.
Okay, so we'll stick with the electricity, although of course you could be getting huge amounts of new demand potentially onto the California ISO. If
We are.
industry leaves gas and goes to electricity, that could get kind of exciting, could it not?
It could. We're looking at probably demand doubling in the next few years as we start to electrify across the board, or as the Energy Commission likes to say, electrify everything, which makes the gas company very nervous.
Indeed, and so it should, but it's the right thing to do. But so 2045, now you've got the president who says, no, California, you may have been way out there and ridiculously over ambitious, but you're not ambitious enough. Actually, the year is 2035.
Correct.
Are you starting to respond to that? I mean, because presumably the only people who are going to know how to get the California ISO to zero or to a clean system by 2035 is yourselves.
Correct. And we are starting to think about that, whether it should be a mandate, because our mandate is 2045. And that is aligned with the decarbonization goals of SB32 as well, which is, 80% below 1990 levels of greenhouse gas emissions. So we're looking for ways to accelerate that and what would enable us to reach that goal faster. And so certainly harnessing demand response.
I don't have a klaxon here for acronyms, but I'm going to get one, I think. SB32, that was the law. That was a California
Senate Bill 32. Yes,
that's a bill that went through in which year, roughly? If you,
I'm not exactly sure. I think 2015.
It was about 6 or 7 years ago.
Yeah, 2015. Yes. Somewhere there. Yeah,
and that demands that California gets to 80% reduction on 1990.
Below 1990 levels of greenhouse gases.
By when?
By 2045 also.
By 2045 also, because of course now the in thing is to shoot for net zero by 2050. So that's 5 years before, but you're still going to have 20% left.
We are.
It
can always change. We can always change. We can always make the goals more ambitious if we're ahead of target.
Let me give you an example from the UK, which is very interesting, because we actually had the goal under the Climate Change Act was 80% reduction from 1990 by 2050. And that's very much enshrined in law in the UK, the Climate Change Act of 2008. One of our cleaning up guests, Baroness Bryony Worthington, actually was the lead author on that act. She was the guest somewhere around, I think, episode 26. But what happened is that act, the goal, was recently upgraded to be net zero by 2050, from 80% reduction to 100% reduction. And the Climate Change Committee, who are the kind of referees, they then calculated the costs. And because of the trends in the cost of electric transportation, renewable energy, et cetera, energy efficiency, they actually said it would cost no more to go to 100%. Then a few years before, they had said it would cost to get to 80% reduction.
Well, that is interesting, because everything that I hear is that those last 5% are the most difficult to achieve and the most expensive. So it'll be interesting to see where they're getting the numbers.
Well, absolutely. I mean, it might be a case study for you to take a look at, particularly if the president is going to demand a plan for net zero 2050, and for presumably that will mean pulling forwards the electrification net zero to 2035.
Especially transportation, because 43% of our greenhouse gases in California are transport related. So we really need to decarbonize the transportation sector.
Now, were you involved at all, you or CAISO, in this kind of tug of war between California and Washington during the last administration under President Trump, of whether you're allowed to push your own transportation fuel standards?
Not really. The ISO wasn't as involved. It was more the California state government and the Air Resources Board. But clearly, we're able to have our own fuel standards. We're able to have our own vehicle standards. California always has had them. And we have always been more stringent than the rest of the states. And the rest of the states kind of follow in our footsteps a few years later. But we do have an executive order that requires that no more sales of internal combustion engines after 2035. So there's going to be rapid decarbonization in the transportation sector. We might even have to accelerate it, which means more charging infrastructure which means the ISO needs to get involved to ensure that the charging happens at the right time and we're not stressing the grid, especially in the evening time when we're experiencing that net peak time frame. So we've got to ensure that people charge according to the requirements and the availability of the grid. Kind of the demand follows the availability of renewables.
Right, so it must be kind of an odd role to be in as the California ISO, because you get all these politicians that make all these statements, whether it's accelerating, going for 2035 or whatever it is, or whether it's saying, no, California's not allowed to ban this or not allowed to make its own standards. And whatever happens, if it goes wrong, you're going to be blamed, right? If there are power cuts, it's definitely your fault, not anybody else's.
Well, we're getting blamed for the power cuts that happened for the public safety shutoffs, right? Because of the fires. And the utilities actually do that, and the utilities control it. Our job is to make sure that we minimize the impact to the extent possible within that utility service territory. But it's a power shutoff and it's a blackout, and customers don't know the difference. So of course the ISO is always the one where they say, oh, well, you caused all of these blackouts, which were quite a few in terms of public safety shutoffs, but we get blamed for it as well.
Okay, now let's talk about those fires, because they're very tragic fires with considerable loss of life, and they were proven to have been caused by sparks, by I think the transformers. Every so often, one of them will blow up, and if the trees are too close, and if there's too much, if the forests have not been appropriately raked, then then there's a fire risk. And that's very, that is how it happened, is it not?
Yes, well, it could be a transformer, it could be just a power line, because power lines, due to heat, tend to sag down, and if they touch a branch, there you have it, a fire happens.
If they touch each other or they touch a branch, then you get
you have a spark, and it happens. And so if you have high winds, especially high temperatures and high winds, and if the throughways for the transmission lines haven't been maintained properly, and there's branches that are where they shouldn't be, which also happens, or you have a spark, it's a tinderbox. And in the forest, it's very difficult to maintain.
And I joke about raking, because that was a word used by President Trump. But the point is that the way to avoid this is maintenance, is actually cutting back, clearing forests away, making sure that your equipment is maintained. And in the case of the worst fires, PG&E had simply not done that. Is that fair?
Well, they have. They do maintain. It's not fair to say that they didn't maintain. There's nothing is 100% exactly all the time. I think what we need to be able to focus on is, yes, public safety shutoffs are useful, but minimizing the territory. They kind of decided to turn the power off wholesale. And then in order to turn the power back on, you have to inspect every single line. You actually have to walk every single line, which took a couple of days. So people were without power for a few days when the public safety shutoff actually was only a few hours. So it took time to de-energize the lines for some time. So that was probably not the smartest thing to do. I think they're becoming much more surgical in how they're going to be deploying the public safety shutoffs, where they absolutely need them, because a lot of people were upset last year and said you cried wolf. And maybe they did, maybe they didn't. 2020 hindsight, you never know. But they're also increasingly going to have to focus in being able to island out those communities that are out in the forested areas, and deploy microgrids and technologies that allow them to basically island out from the transmission lines, yet be able to have enough power where they are in order to be able to be safe and allow those safety shutoffs to happen. I think what we're going to be seeing in the next few years is the ability to have microgrids throughout California. They're able to island out, and that would also help in stress conditions where, due to climate change, we may see more heat events like we did last year. So that if you're able to, island out 2,000 or 3,000 megawatts throughout the state, with energy efficiency and with DER and with microgrids and storage, and are able to operate independently from the grid, that also makes us much more resilient, not only in stress grid conditions, but also through natural disasters.
Okay, I don't have my klaxon, but DER is distributed energy resources. So that would be
Yes.
all of the local solar, maybe some local wind connected to the distribution grids, anything else that you can do
And
locally.
storage, yes.
And of course, batteries and for storage. But just backing up, just to make sure that people are following, when you talk about the public safety shutoffs, so this is when the utility, for instance, a PG&E, says, well, we're expecting high temperatures and high winds. It's going to be dangerous conditions. So rather than risk starting a fire, we're just going to do a power cut. We're actually going to impose a power cut. And thousands or even hundreds of thousands of homes then wait for the weather to change before they can get the power back. And of course, people get incredibly annoyed.
Yes, they de-energize the lines, and then to energize them again, they have to inspect them.
Right.
And that takes time. Yes.
And then when you talk about islanding, for clarity, that would be saying, well, we can shut off this high voltage line, but the people can still get power because they've got a big battery locally and they can ride through.
And I have a microgrid. Yes.
And they maybe have a microgrid with some local DER, distributed energy resources, so they can continue to run their lives. And this becomes ferociously important, does it not, when transport is electrified as well? Because it's one thing to say, well, there's a power cut, but if there's an emergency, you can still get the ambulances in and out. You can do public safety with the police cars can still run. But if you really have electric transportation and you have these power cuts for whatever reason, doesn't it become very, very brittle, the whole situation socially? I mean, the risk of something bad happening really ramps up, does it not?
Not necessarily, because with distributed energy resources, like we said, if you have solar all over the place and you have it on people's homes too, we have 10,000 rooftops coming online every month in California. So a lot of our resources for solar are behind the meter in people's homes or in businesses. So if you have a combination of solar and a battery, so what if the power goes down? You still have the solar, you have the battery, you can charge the vehicle. Indeed, you can use the vehicle's battery as a resource of energy as well in the evening, and many people do that as additional security. So we see that as an added level of resiliency, much more so than an added level of problems. Again, the issue is, making sure you charge at the right time.
I think that's right. I was going to say, I think that's right. If there's planning so that you have enough resource locally to do the island, to fulfill the demand. And then, of course, the digital management of it all has to work.
Yes, it does. Yes, I completely agree. Planning is going to be very, very important in terms of how we decarbonize and bring in the transportation sector. And if we've learned one lesson, is that you need to have a variety of resources. You cannot be just solar centric, 100% solar for your renewables. You've got to balance renewables with renewables, whether it's going to be hydro, whether it's going to be wind, whether it's going to be geothermal, whether it's going to be any other kind of biomass or resource that comes in and balances your renewable is very important. Regional integration, very important. We need to be able to rely on our neighbors. They can rely on us. If we can tap more into the Pacific Northwest hydro, that is actually a huge benefit for us. I think they're also very interested in collaborating on offshore wind development, so we can partner as well. So partnerships on a geographic scale are going to be very important, especially with like-minded states. And what we've seen as a result of the energy imbalance market, or maybe the overall sentiment, even during the Trump administration, which was very interesting, was a reduction in coal, a massive increase in renewables. And a lot of states all around us, whether it's New Mexico, whether it's Washington, whether it's Oregon or Arizona, and even Colorado, pushing forward renewable energy standards 50, 60, and 100% and beyond, very much like California.
And what is the current status of geothermal in the West, in that Western region? So I'll declare my interest, which is that I'm an advisor to a company called Ever, which just got funded by BP, Chevron, and Temasek, the Singapore Investment Authority. And it's advanced geothermal. It's not fracking. It's a closed loop system using, but it goes deep enough to get a fluid, to get water, high enough temperature to generate electricity.
Right.
And to me, that's very promising. Of course, lots of questions about the cost, but are you planning on any more geothermal, or has that been the sort of promised so often that because you've not mentioned it so far? We're half an hour
Oh,
in.
we're excited about it. No, we're very excited about geothermal, and we know we have geothermal resources in California, especially in the Imperial Valley, which is one of the areas that needs the jobs as well. They have the highest unemployment in the state, but also there's an added benefit with the geothermal resources in the Imperial Valley. There's a lot of lithium. So they believe that concurrently with the geothermal operations, you'll be able to pull out a lot of lithium, and they're hopeful to become the lithium valley of the world, so that we can support the manufacturing of batteries as well in-state with in-state lithium, which we're all excited about. But yes, geothermal is important. It's 24/7 renewable. It's a little bit more expensive than solar, but we do need it for the balancing, and we do need it for the base load, and it's a good resource.
Although the EVER solution is a closed loop, so there'd be no lithium because you're not extracting the brines, the water. It's just going round and round. It's very exciting.
Well, but if you can access the lithium and you can pull it out together with those operations, that's what they're exploring right now. Then why not?
No, absolutely. That would be geographically in a difference. Absolutely, would be very exciting, because we're going to need probably going to need a lot of lithium. If we just taking a step back from California for a moment, I met you at the Paris COP negotiations in 2015. You were there with your daughter. I was enormously impressed because you took her out of school because you said, frankly, she's going to learn more by coming to see this process and being part of it than she will by sitting in a classroom, which I thought was very sort of brave and progressive.
Yes, and she has blossomed into an environmental leader in her own right. She's created a club in her school. They have solar panels. She's now making sure that they have batteries. She would like to create a microgrid. She's taken an internship in hydrogen at UCI, the University of California at Irvine. So she's working on fuel cells. So look what we created in 2015. The 11-year-old came to COP, and now she's going to be one. I'm confident. She did an internship at the California Energy Commission at the president's office as well for youth leadership. So she's going to be carrying the flag, and we'll be proud of her.
So my eldest is now 11, and of course we have COP coming up in Glasgow, and so I am absolutely planning to have her come and visit. I don't know about attending the full 2 weeks. I'm not sure that Glasgow in November has quite the appeal of 2 weeks in Paris in 2015. But
she loved it.
I'm sure it was a unique and memorable experience. But a lot of what we talk about at the COPs is actually the developing world and how to balance development and spreading the wealth and human well-being to developing countries who have, in some cases, tremendous fossil fuel resources, but you want them to kind of follow the California path. You want them to leapfrog to the sorts of things that you've been talking about. How do you think about that? Because that command center that I visited was so sophisticated. It was being run by somebody with sort of 2 PhDs from Germany who'd been running a system operator in Germany, or I think he'd come out of Siemens. There was enormous sophistication. And then, you could see that feasibly in South Africa. But when you start to look at countries that, I don't want to say anything bad about the countries, just they don't have those sorts of, Siemens educated PhD electrical engineers kind of running around, for their electrical system in great numbers. The Mozambiques, the Ethiopias, the Malis, the Vietnams, the Bangladeshs, and these are countries that absolutely have to be on this journey. But how do you help them?
Well, that's interesting. You know, I grew up in East Africa, Tanzania, so I'm very familiar with the area. And I also am part of an organization that is a grassroots African organization, Re-Energy Africa. And I think the way we're going to have to look at those countries transitioning, because they still need to electrify the population, right? They're like 30–40% electrified at best, is to start opposite of us. We started with a large grid and large infrastructures and centralized power stations. They're going to need to go backwards. They're going to start with the microgrids, with the individual solar systems and batteries in a community, microgridding that community, hopefully able to bring in education, being able to bring in industry, being able to bring in transportation, because you can charge electric vehicles with batteries and with solar and with indigenous resources. Most of those countries are blessed with good renewable resources as well. And then the centralized grid can come in later, interconnect the microgrids, and create a larger infrastructure that way. I see that as a much more feasible path than building centralized fossil-powered resources with a backbone grid and then providing electricity for the rest of the nation. That hasn't worked. The beauty of renewable energy and microgrids is that it's almost instantaneous. You can have a community powered with batteries, solar, and maybe some other resources. Kenya, for instance, has quite a lot of geothermal in the Rift Valley, and they're developing that. I've seen it, and it's very exciting as well. There are hydropower resources as well that can be harnessed. And that's what the country should be looking at in terms of developing and in terms of creating electricity on a fast track, bringing the economic well-being of the community. That also empowers girls. It goes into all of these good initiatives from a social level, and especially educating young people. And they can have access to world-class education remotely. And God knows we've all learned how to do that in the past year. My kids have been learning remotely and online for years, so it can be done. And that's what I'm hoping to see happen. And that's what I hope the international institutions will focus on, as opposed to bringing in massive infrastructure projects that take decades and are not going to end up electrifying people as fast as we need them to.
No, I think I'm going to sort of partially agree, and because I've often been in the, I've often made the case that you've just made, which is that a lot of the international institutions, it's not that they're blind to the distributed solutions. They just don't have the processors. They don't have the knowledge. It's much easier to do one big project than tens of thousands of villages. But the answer, I think, has to be both, because that answer that you just gave is not very satisfying for Lagos or for Accra or for, because there are cities and there are industries that need large scale power. So for the rural areas, I agree. I mean, if you look at rural Ethiopia, you're never going to have a sort of big centralized power stations and pylons looping thousands of miles. But for the cities and the heavy industry, we've got to find solutions that can enable wealth creation and all of the benefits for those countries.
Right. I was just talking to the remote areas and electrifying the remote areas, because that's what our organization is also focused on, kind of like the cell phone leapfrogging the wires and directly going into providing the service to the rural communities. As for the city centers, yes, that's a different story. We need to figure out how we can power those city centers and of course enable industry to thrive and enable economic development, but also look at the progress that Argentina has made in terms of wind and in terms of very quickly, and we both know Sebastian Kind and the Renovar project that basically enabled Argentina in a very short time frame to become a leader in wind generation and integration into their grid, offsetting the need for a large swath of fossil fuels. Of course, they did have the benefit of a centralized grid. That was something that the country already had, but there are ways for it to be done, and there's organizations focused on making that happen as well.
And you've reminded me, I need to get Sebastian Kind. Green Map is the organization he now runs, but he's responsible for, I think it's $7 or $8 billion of investment in wind going into Argentina just a few years after they were nationalizing Repsol's assets. So
exactly,
incredible turnaround, incredible clever design of policy. So the organization that you mentioned was Renewable. Wait a minute, what was it for Africa?
Renovar. That was
not
the
Renovar.
renewable.
Yes.
The one about
Re-energize,
Argentina?
I think it was Re-energize Africa, because we're going to put a link.
Re-energy Africa, yes.
Re-energy Africa. We're going to
Yes.
put a link into the show notes for sure. That's one of the things we can do.
Great.
And in fact, that's a topic also. I don't know if you noticed that Tony Blair was our first guest on series 3 of Cleaning Up. And he also talked about the importance and the opportunity of repowering or powering Africa. But we'll put a link to your organization as well. Now, are you going to be, final question, are you going to be coming to Glasgow for COP26?
I don't have plans for that yet. It's going to depend on how the pandemic is, how our travel policies are, and how everything is working out. So no firm plans yet. I would love to. Okay,
well, so I have at this point no plans to come to California, although I would love to. So that was perhaps the first opportunity that we were going to have to catch up in person. And I strongly suspect that if you don't come to COP26, we'd miss you enormously because I'm going to be there. But if you don't come, then certainly I would very much hope during 2022 to come and visit you and maybe even visit the same control room at the California ISO again and see how you've developed since my last visit.
Oh, yes. I mean, you definitely should, because our footprint has grown. Our activities have grown. We're very excited. We've had over 170 countries visit. We're very, very open to educating countries. And that's why Argentina came, Brazil came, a lot of the Eastern Europeans have come to basically study and to learn what it takes to operate a grid and what it takes to operate a control center. So it's extremely rewarding. And I'm Eastern European. I come from Bulgaria originally. Let's not also forget the Eastern Bloc. That's a very important and challenging area of the world that needs to decarbonize rapidly too. And they're straddled with an old fossil-based infrastructure. And it's very difficult to get that area of the world to decarbonize on the schedule we need them to decarbonize. So we've got our work cut out for us.
Very good. And so now everybody listening to this podcast or YouTube episode will know that where I go to learn is the California ISO control room. And I'm looking forward to my next visit.
Well, definitely. And I hope I'm still chair of the board when you come.
Thank you very much for joining us today, Angelina. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you, Michael. It has been wonderful.
Stay safe. Bye-bye.
Bye.
So that was Angelina Galiteva, chair of the California Independent System Operator, talking about some of the challenges as California moves to 100% clean electricity. My guest next week on Cleaning Up is Gina Demanig. She's the managing partner of Emerald Technology Ventures, one of the preeminent energy and industrial venture investors in Europe. Please join me at this time next week for a conversation with Gina Demanig.